All right, we're starting a new area again. After the first test, we're now going to be talking about the life sciences. And this is going to take us mostly to a discussion about ourselves. We're going to spend most of the time, particularly after next week, talking more about our own health, medicine, our own minds, and consciousness and other issues. And we'll be talking eventually about a lot of our future technology in the health sciences. But before I go too far, again, I'm a traditional biologist. When I learned biology, we still had one semester of zoology and another semester of botany. I mean, there really wasn't much in terms of cellular and molecular biology. Well, today, it's almost all cellular and molecular biology. I mean, if you were a biology major, your introductory classes would be 3/4 about cells and molecular biology and biochemistry, and we would put plants and animals in the second semester as much as we could, talk about ecology, things like that. But really, it's just moving so fast. When our knowledge is moving so fast in terms of what we understand about ourselves and our physiology, that we just don't have room to go into the traditional routes. Now we have degree plans that can prepare people who want to be, like me, a field scientist or work with organisms and organismal biology, but you still have to have the foundation of the biochemistry more so than you used to. But I want to start with that perspective, that more traditional perspective about biodiversity, because this in itself is a big issue today. What's happening to biodiversity today? What's the value of biodiversity? So it's an opportunity to perhaps walk through a little bit of the taxonomy, the taxonomic hierarchy of life on Earth, and we're going to spend some more time with that in next week's lab. But it's also an opportunity to bring up some issues that will tie us to what we were talking about, particularly with the environment. We're talking about agriculture and some of the issues that presented, the Green Revolution, and so on has fed a lot of more people and allowed the world's population to go up and for poverty to go down. But it's also introduced a lot of environmental issues and so forth. And one of those actually is a challenge to biodiversity. So we're going to start with this perspective. Why is this important? Why is biodiversity important? There are a lot of people who are claiming that we are causing a mass extinction event currently. If you look at Earth's history, and if you remember our hopscotch, you can see that there are extinction events that punctuate the ends of most of the time periods, and particularly the two eras that we've studied, the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic, both ended with a major mass extinction event. And the Paleozoic ended because of acidic oceans, the oceans becoming acidic, because of volcanism changing the atmosphere, changing the climate very rapidly, the shallow seas perhaps also becoming anoxic, running out of oxygen. The end of the Mesozoic ended with similar situations, but also with an impact of a meteor that destroyed, or that caused a nuclear winter, caused that to happen a lot faster. But if you measure the rate of extinction today and compare it to the rates of extinction at those two events, things are going extinct faster today than they were at any other time in Earth's history. Now, part of that is a question of resolution. We don't know every species that exists on the planet yet, but we know a lot of them, a lot more than we'd know from the fossil record at each of those other previous times. The fossil record only preserves a fraction of the life that actually lived then. So there's a lot missing there. Certainly in terms of how many species actually went extinct, we have a good estimate. But today we can actually measure it. We can actually say, oh look, there used to be this species and now it's gone. It's not here anymore. And we're seeing that at a more rapid rate than we've ever seen before. A lot of that too is because of the rainforests that we're cutting down. And when you look at each acre of rainforest, every time we look at a new acre of rainforest, we find new species we'd never seen before. And these are species of insects, but also birds and even mammals. We even occasionally find new mammals that we didn't know existed before. Most of this is in the rainforest. Most of the rest of the world has been pretty well explored, and we'd be very surprised to find something we really hadn't seen before in another ecosystem. But knowing that we're finding new species in every acre of rainforest, there are thousands of acres of rainforest being destroyed yearly that we have not had a chance to explore. So we have no idea what we're losing. So it brings up some of these questions. Why is this important? Why do we even care? Right? Does it bother you if a butterfly species goes extinct in the Amazon rainforest? I use the butterfly as an example because we'll get around to the butterfly effect eventually, talk a little bit more about that, and you're probably familiar with that term. The butterfly effect meaning that small changes in a system can lead to big outcomes because of chaos theory. And so again, we'll come back to chaos theory. But right now I want to focus on 10 reasons why we should care about biodiversity. 10 reasons why it's important to protect biodiversity. And these are not all, and you're going to see, these run the gamut from being economic arguments to being aesthetic arguments to being moral arguments. Number one, we'll start off with the moral argument. And these quotes are taken from a list that was put together. I forget what organization originally put this together because it actually was harder to find now in this original shape. People have sort of made these statements before. I like these 10, but you'll see there's some redundancy too, so we'll see why other lists might only have 5 or 7 or whatever. But we didn't create life on Earth and it's not our place to destroy it. That would be the moral argument, right? Who are we to decide what species are allowed to survive and which ones can go extinct? Now we do this, but some would argue that violates our own ethics of respect and fairness, and that we should be more protective of the planet, stewards of the planet, and that's our responsibility. So that's the moral argument. The second one is a more practical argument. Don't pop rivets on spaceship Earth. And this goes to our ignorance, actually. It goes to the point that we don't really fully understand all of the systems that we're impacting. We don't understand why forests change. Right now is a good example. We don't understand why amphibians are going extinct faster than any other group. Amphibians are frogs and salamanders and things like that may seem vulnerable when you think about it, but they evolved in the early Paleozoic. They've been around through both of those extinction events. They've survived much more dramatic changes in Earth's climate and so forth, but now we're seeing them go extinct very rapidly. We're also seeing coral reefs bleaching and going and dying. And we're not exactly sure why. We don't know what's going on. We're going to get to another part of this. Again, there's going to be some redundancy. We're going to see some aspects of this practical argument that will come into play. But at this point, let's just recognize that everything is connected. There's you can't compartmentalize nature. Now, we try to do this in an urban environment, but we've had to learn that even in an urban environment, we need to protect we need to do as much as we can to allow for things to work around us so that they're not damaged, and not just for this moral argument, but for this practical argument and the ways we're going to flesh this out in a little bit. Killing species is like randomly popping rivets off of spaceship Earth. 1 or 2 may not cause a problem, but eventually the ship's going to come apart, right? If you were out in space and you saw a rivet pop out, you'd probably start getting pretty worried, wouldn't you? If you saw another one or then a third one, then you'd start panicking a little bit. So thinking about it this way, and thinking about it in terms of the Earth itself as more or less our spaceship carrying us through space, we do want to keep it in a state of health that can sustain us going forward. And the third one frames the third part of this, and again, we're going to see probably 3 or 4 themes. This is the economic argument, and this is the one that really comes into play when we talk about rainforests in particular. Not just rainforests, but a couple of other things too, and again, we'll flesh this out. We know most of what we know right now about medicine from nature. There's traditional wisdom that has always sort of known that natural products could help alleviate pain and even heal some conditions. right? I mean, there's traditional, when I use the word traditional wisdom, that can be used in two different ways. In one respect, it really is to honor traditional wisdom that we've had before science, before anything else. There have been, in our society, people who studied nature and health and found things that could help, right? It's still popular today to think about herbal medicines and these other types of alternative treatments that might help. Now, the other use of the term traditional wisdom, however, is a reference to a logical fallacy, that if you rely upon traditional wisdom, you're just as likely to make a mistake as you are to get it right, because there wasn't any science involved. So yes, they occasionally hit upon some treatments that would help alleviate pain and might even have been somewhat antibacterial without realizing it, but there were also a lot of things done that were toxic and were killing people as often as helping them. And you can even think back into European history with leeches. Actually, we're using leeches again, but not to the extent in the way that they were being used, and people were being bled to death trying to get rid of the demons in their blood and so forth. Yes.
What is this for?
What's that?
What is that for?
Leeches? Well, there are some situations where a wound it can't be cleaned, and leeches are good at actually cleaning a wound. They can get in there and get the dead cells out of the way so that the flesh can actually heal a little bit better. So used in a proper way, they've actually turned out to be somewhat useful. But in the past, they were used to drain as much blood from somebody as possible, because the belief was that the blood carried the toxin or carried an evil spirit or something, that if you could get that out, they'd be okay. So traditional wisdom isn't always very wise. There are some things, right? If we put it to the test, then we can find some things that were traditionally used and have been very useful, and that's what starts this whole process. Hey, look at that. That bark that they've been using to alleviate pain has a chemical in it that we can isolate and turn into aspirin, right? I mean, aspirin comes from the bark of a tree. Bread mold, right? Your bread goes moldy, and you're not going to eat it anymore, but guess what? You can isolate a chemical out of that mold, and it will kill bacteria. The observation of the fact that, and we'll come around to that too, but the fact that the bread mold produced penicillin was a big discovery. These medicines, and most medicines that we have today, even today, have come from natural sources. Now, we originally find them in nature, we isolate them and use them as drugs, and we have to keep harvesting them from nature. Eventually, we get to where we can make them synthetically. So a lot of drugs are made in a lab now and don't require us to go out and find the plant itself or the animal from which we get that toxin, but we still discover most of our new drugs that way. We're discovering new drugs and new potential drugs all the time in species that are found in the rainforest, because they're very specialized. And because of the diversity of the rainforest and the specialization of those strategies for survival, they do produce a lot of potential treatments that we can find. So if we're losing hundreds of species a year to destroying the rainforest, we're losing that opportunity. We have no idea what we're losing, but we know we're losing an opportunity to find something that could either treat a disease or become a new product. Again, if you think of rubber, started as a natural resource, those kinds of materials can still be looked for. Before we had oil and gas, fossil fuels, right? Whales almost were driven to extinction because we needed their oil. We needed their oil not just to burn in lamps, but to make other types of products from, lubricants and on and on. And there still are discoveries in nature that allow us to develop new materials that have applications that are really pretty amazing. So the more we lose that opportunity and the economic benefit that would come from those discoveries. Bulk of our food, clothing, and building materials have always come from nature, and we're always looking for new things and finding them. Right? If we weren't actually finding new things every day, this wouldn't be as strong of an argument, but we are. We're still finding new things in nature that help us and help our economy. And finally, the fourth one, which frames our fourth sort of theme here, and that's the aesthetic argument. Nature's beautiful, right? We all like to be part of nature. Even those of us who live in cities or have grown up in a city most of our lives still have, some connection to the parks, or getting out of the city a little bit and camping and fishing, or even just sailing. A connection with nature is actually important, and it's been shown psychologically to be very important. There's a lot of concern that many people suffer from what's called nature deficit disorder. That if you aren't connected to nature in some way, it actually leads to depression and to a lack of focus and to other psychological issues. Yes?
You say if you are connected?
If you are not connected at all to nature, nature deficit disorder is a possibility. Now, this is one reason why parks are such a big deal in a city and why Houston spends money on its park system. Because a lot of people don't have that opportunity to leave the city, to go to the hill country or to go to the beach and really experience nature. But we all recognize, whether it's from being there or seeing pictures or movies, that there's a lot of beauty out there, and we appreciate that. We appreciate that beauty. So just for the sake of preserving that beautiful landscape and all of the species of life that thrive in these landscapes, that's another good argument for preserving this. Now, we have to balance all of these, right? On the other side, we always have the fact that, well, we need jobs. We need the cities are, more people live in cities now than not in cities and this is a fairly recent, and this is globally, that more people live in cities than in the country, in rural areas, I should say. So we do need cities. Cities have been a big part of what has allowed us to produce the technological society that we have today. So we have to find a balance, though, between developing our cities and providing jobs and building on that economic structure, at the same time looking at these other things. And so we've got these four sort of themes to go on, and let's look at them a little more carefully. The genetic argument, genetic strength argument, is part of the economic argument, actually. In lab this week, we're talking a little bit about diet and nutrition and food. We talked last week about agriculture and where we are today with big business, agribusiness, and how it has gotten to the point where seeds can be patented. Well, we've always known, and part of what led to the first green revolution was hybridization, right? We've always known that we've needed to bring in wild genes and hybridize those wild species with our cultivated species to keep them healthy. That if we don't do that, then they become genetically weak and can't survive, and become more susceptible to disease and more susceptible to the cold and so forth. So we need wild species constantly to maintain the health of our cultivated species, our crops. If we can't continue to do that, then our crops will eventually fail, no matter how good we are at genetic engineering. Because a lot of genetic engineering is say, oh, look, there's a good gene over here. Let's take it from this plant and put it in another one. If we don't have the wild plant to identify that gene, to isolate that gene from, even modern technologies will eventually, maybe we'll end up with Soylent Green. Anyone seen that movie? Know what I'm talking about, Soylent Green? There was a movie with Charlton Heston about a future, of course, a dystopian future, and everyone was eating these bars of different colors, and they were called Soylent Yellow, Soylent Brown, Soylent Green, different things. Sort of reminds me of all the power bars, energy bars that we're starting to eat now, and because they're all balanced perfectly, right? They have just the right protein, the right fats, the right sugars, the right vitamins and minerals are all put in there so that you probably could actually survive eating nothing but these protein bars, these power bars. And so this was long before there were these products, there was this movie that had this idea that we were all just surviving on these. Well, supposedly each one color represented somewhat of the source. There were no more farms because we had destroyed the environment, but there were supposedly greenhouses in space or wherever else, and they were harvesting these things, and so Soylent Red would have protein, and Soylent Brown would have grain, Soylent Green vegetables, and Charlton Heston's character realized that Soylent Green was actually people that were being recycled into these energy bars. And so there's a famous scene where I forget exactly, Soylent Green is people, it's people. Anyway, Charlton Heston, if you don't know who that is, he was an actor in a lot of very dramatic roles. And that's been parodied over and over again, Saturday Night Live, and so it's really funny. But these kinds of, I bring up movies and things like this sometimes because they often, they look for something in our zeitgeist, our cultural consciousness that we are worried about or we're afraid of. And then build on that and make that the plot of a movie. And so people have been worried about this depersonalization of ourselves, our nature deficit disorder, meaning we're disconnected from nature and from the planet, and that dehumanizes us in some way. And it may dehumanize us to the point where we're willing to recycle our own dead into our food supply. A little bit extreme, but that's what those movies are made for. And that started back 1984, that movie, Brave New World, back in the early 20th century. There were dystopian novels being written about the dangers of all these trends in the future. If we don't pay attention, these horrible futures are going to happen. And maybe we're in one, maybe we're there. We tend to get comfortable with things over time. So if somebody from the 1920s were transported to today, would they be amazed, or would they be disgusted, or would they be shocked? What would be their reaction? It might be interesting to get a perspective like that. Likewise, if we put ourselves 100 years into the future, what would we think of that future? Where are we going to go? These are the kinds of questions, again, in the next few weeks I want to try to ask or start asking in lab. But genetic diversity is part of that economic argument, because without wild species, we can't keep our crops healthy. And obviously, if our crops fail, our economy fails. I mean, it's still pretty integral to our overall economy, being able to grow food and trade food. I mean, the stock exchange started by trading agricultural futures, right? Betting on agricultural yields. That's the whole point of it. It's branched out, of course, but it still has that. You still have those markets. Another one that has to do with a little bit about economics. We constantly need new discoveries. We're currently in a situation, for instance, where penicillin and other antibiotics are not as effective as they used to be. In fact, have been shown they're breeding resistant bacteria that are even more dangerous. Flesh-eating bacteria, for instance. Hospitals are probably the most dangerous place to be, because that's where this is happening faster than anywhere else. Now, not to say don't go to the hospital if you need to be in the hospital, but we are seeing some problems with bacteria that now are not affected by antibiotics. The overuse of antibiotics is something we'll talk a lot about. I'll bring this up again in a couple other points. Even antibacterial soaps and cleansers. I mean, there's no need for there to be antibacterial agents in your hand soap. But most of us go to the store and say, oh, here's antibacterial versus regular. I'm getting the antibacterial, right? That's got to be better. Well, it's not, because it's actually breeding antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which are more dangerous, right? Wash your hands, do a good job of washing your hands, and that's a lot safer for you in the long run. Yes?
Usually, I'm a movie fan, but isn't that usually how it ends up happening, where the super bug or whatever it is
right.
comes out and stuff, does what, has this infection of the earth, is usually behind something that they're saying, like, some kind of the use of these antibacterial things over and over and over have developed to where we get these things that are immune to whatever.
Right.
And all our.
There's an interesting progression of these kinds of movies. The first one that sort of hit on this fear of having a superbug was the Andromeda strain. Now, the Andromeda strain actually came from space. It was a satellite or something that we'd put up into space, and it picked up this agent that, when it landed back on Earth, it crashed, caused disease, and they isolated it and they figured out how to cure it. The guy who wrote Andromeda strain was the same doctor who wrote Jurassic Park. It was one of his early successes. But again, the idea was we were starting to realize there are viruses, right? This was sort of early on when we started realizing how scary viruses are, as opposed to just bacteria. Antibiotics have no effect on a virus, and you should know that. Everyone should know that you don't take antibiotics for a viral infection. So doctors used to prescribe antibiotics when you had a virus just so you wouldn't get a secondary bacterial infection. Of course, they've stopped doing that now because, antibacterial resistance. At least they don't do that very often. Hopefully they don't do that very often anymore. But we don't have, the only way we really have of treating a virus is through immunizations. To try to damage the virus in some way and inoculate ourselves so that our immune systems recognize it and can deal with it if we were infected. That's why your vaccines are so important, because that's what protects you from viruses. And we've eliminated some really, really scary stuff. But there's always this underlying fear that something we won't be able to cure and it's going to cause an epidemic. Yes?
Well, you're talking about vaccines. Can it get to the point where we have too many vaccines that they avoid all these other diseases, but like they say, another disease might come around where it's immune to?
No, not really. Now, a vaccine is a different situation than the antibacterial resistance. But what can happen, for instance, with flu? The reason you have to get a flu vaccine every year, flu is a very general term. There are thousands of flu viruses. And a vaccine may work for one or a few, but not for all of them. And so, yes, there are new strains every year of flu, but they're not being driven by vaccines. That's a natural process. They just naturally change. The virus that causes AIDS, the HIV virus, has part of the difficulty of developing a vaccine is how quickly it changes on its own. So you might develop a way of vaccinating, and then it just naturally changes away from that. But it's not being driven the same way that antibiotic resistance is. And there's some reasons for that. Again, a vaccine is a virus doesn't have the same selection process that a bacteria does, but there is the natural mutation process and we'll talk a lot more about evolution next week, and genetics in labs. So we'll come back to this a lot. Yes.
Do you think that maybe we're going into an era where we're overusing medicine and all these vaccines and antibiotics?
Well, we've definitely realized that we're overusing antibiotics.
Isn't it making us more vulnerable now? Because my grandpa lived to 111,
right.
And he lived in farm where no medical attention is really accessible. He really didn't have access to no vaccines, no medications and stuff like that.
But, and that's true, and that's true. There are examples like that. But the average age has been rising steadily since we've been developing new medicines. So I do think that we are, with antibiotics, again, this is sort of an alarm that we're sounding, and it is something that we shouldn't be too ignorant of everything. Maybe we're overusing some other things and it is making us weak. But in the big picture, medicine is a huge advance. I mean, we have saved lives and extended our life expectancy tremendously just in the last century because of medicine. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, right? You don't want to say, oh, I'm not going to go to the doctor then, oh my goodness, right? I'm just going to treat myself and take my herbal tea, drink my herbal tea, right? I mean, drink your herbal tea, but go to the doctor too. You can't give up on the whole system. So there's some validity here. This is what we need to find is, again, our healthy skepticism has got to allow us to look at all of this, examine this, and find the right path for each of us individually, but also as a society. Let me get back a little bit to the question where we started with the breeding a superbug kind of thing, because from the Andromeda strain, we've then seen other movies where, or the book, The Hot Zone. If you haven't read it, you probably should read The Hot Zone. It's about the Ebola virus, and we've just had a recent outbreaks of Ebola that are very scary. I mean, this is a virus that is very lethal, but it's also very difficult to get. And so when we come back to viruses, we'll talk a little bit about the reason you are very susceptible to colds is that it's a variety of viruses that are very easy to pass from one person to another, but they're not likely to kill you. Versus Ebola, which is likely to kill you, but it's not easy to get it. You have to actually have contact with bodily fluids and so on. Now, the thing about Ebola is it's nasty. I mean, it makes you bleed and it does generate a lot of dangerous bodily fluids. But if you can isolate it, quarantine it, you can contain it. It's not going to get out. Okay, and the symptoms show up pretty quickly, and so on. So there's always a trade-off with a virus. A virus can be very lethal, but difficult to pass on, or very mild and easy to pass on. Those kinds of things. Yes.
When you think it's happening to like the kids, like how are people getting their body to school and like having like flu-like symptoms, and then to go to the hospital because they like can't breathe? I don't know if you've seen that on the news recently.
I'm going to come out here and hear what you're saying better. I only thought about half of that. I don't care what I'm hearing, so from the all the way there. Go ahead. Again, I don't mean to make light of flu. The worst epidemic in history was a flu epidemic that hit in the 1800s. There are also things more recently like SARS and the bird flu and these other things that are similar, and the symptoms are similar. And you have to take them seriously. So these recent outbreaks sometimes, that's what we worry about, right? The mosquitoes that are carrying the viruses around here, what's the term I'm trying to think of? What's that? Yeah, West Nile, right? That's very serious. And the first symptoms appear like flu. They seem to be flu. So more often now, if a kid in the school has flu symptoms and they can't really figure out, they're going to send them to the hospital because they just need the diagnostic tools there to help them. Yeah.
Is there, like you were saying with the Ebola, it develops a certain way. Is there any? Well, I guess it may be possible, but like Ebola developing, like how easily a cold is transferred, or is there things like
Not likely.
They develop into?
Not likely, and that's where these movies tend to sort of go wrong.
Okay.
We have to think about our bodies really have good defenses. So if something is easy to get, it's easy for our bodies to see. Because for a virus, to get from one person to another, it either has to have a coating that can allow it to survive in the air or in water, or it has to give up that coating and then get transferred by blood or semen or something like that. So the coating makes it easy for your immune system to see it. So colds have those kinds of coatings. So you can sneeze and literally, and you might not want to think about it, but the dust in the air, these things stay in the air for a long time. It takes a long time for them to settle out. And they settle on all the surfaces and everything else, so you put your hand on the doorknob and you catch a cold. But Ebola has given up that coating so that it can get past your body's defenses. But that means it can't survive in the air. It can't survive on a surface. It would be destroyed by oxygen. And those are the two extremes, and there's like everything in between.
So they don't. Well, I mean, but developing the traits of another virus sometimes is. I mean, is that? I guess that's kind of where I was going at. That's usually how it seems to happen. Like it has done this thing, now it's developed a trait of the common cold, and it's easily passed on. So I guess that's what I was wondering.
Well, now, if the Ebola virus became more like developed those traits, it wouldn't be as infectious. It wouldn't be as likely to kill you. Now, there's some interesting evidence that our genes actually contain old viruses that have just gotten incorporated into our genome as junk DNA. It's sort of like the most successful virus ever. Because, again, a virus isn't a conscious thing. It's not even an organism. It is DNA or RNA that is able to trick your cells into making copies of it. Well, if it can get itself to make a copy generation after generation after generation, it's like a perfect virus. And of course, it's not causing any disease because it's just part of our own DNA. So viruses do change over time. There's no question about that. And viruses do go that way you're talking about, from being very virulent to less virulent, because they've adapted a different strategy. As a matter of fact, again, read the hot zone, and there's some questions that maybe, the Ebola virus that comes in different strains, some of them have done just that, have appeared to have become less virulent. There was a big concern. They were doing research for monkeys in Washington, D.C., and the monkeys got loose with the Ebola virus. And so, I mean, this never got out publicly, but there was a lot of real concern, or panic even, that was going to introduce the Ebola virus to the human population. We're going to have a huge epidemic, and it didn't happen. That particular strain just turned out to have changed enough not to be virulent to humans anymore. That doesn't mean Ebola is not still a big deal. So anyway, all of these things, again, anything we talk about with science, we're going to see good benefits and concerns. You're always going to have two sides to something. So as we develop new medications, we're constantly looking for or trying to study that. But getting back to this argument, for us to continue to learn and continue to understand what's going on, we have to have a diversity of things to study. And if we get more and more, less and less genetically diverse, not only ourselves, but species that we're studying, we run into problems. So the research argument is part of that economic argument. But it's sort of brings us to this side where we're looking for economic development, but avoiding economic impacts that could be dangerous, like disease and so forth. Okay. Let's get back to sort of the part of the aesthetic argument, and we call this the education argument. I think many scientists like myself have become scientists for this reason, not because I expected to change the world, because to be honest, I'm studying diatoms in wetlands. There are some applications there because they're mitigation wetlands, and we're looking at how they impact our water quality and things like that. But I didn't go into it thinking that. I just was curious. I want to know. I'm curious. Nature is fascinating. And when you look at the behaviors of animals, they're amazing, right? Some of the bird behaviors that we see, the mating behaviors and different behaviors. Anyway, I was going to bats recently. I think we've seen some bats in our backyard recently. It's just fascinating to watch how they capture the mosquitoes and things like that. And so studying nature really does have benefits. And we're not ignoring those arguments here, but we're saying that even beside those benefits is just the information that we get, that what we understand is interesting and we want to know. And we'll tie this back together with the last one again when we get there. Recreation, another part of this argument. But it's also part of the economic argument. It's mostly part of the aesthetic, because that's why we go out there, to see the beauty, to experience that. But it's also economic. Most of the money that goes into protecting biodiversity comes from licenses that hunters and fishermen pay. All right, so it may seem a little odd sometimes, but it's true, and it's the only way to sustainable. If you want to go out there and fish or hunt, you pay for a license, we take that money, and we use it to protect the environment, to preserve the environment. So one of the most effective conservation organizations are those that are organized by hunters and the fishing community. The Gulf Coast Conservation Association, for instance, is a very effective one. And they work with other groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Buffalo Bayou Partnership, and I could go on and on, to protect the environment, to create regulations, but also to actually go out there and manage populations. One of the things we have, another reason I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but think about deer, right? We like deer. Deer are pretty, they're cute, but we don't like mountain lions because they scare us. So we've killed most of the mountain lions. And so now there's too many deer. The deer populations really are a problem. It's not healthy for the deer. There are so many deer. But their predators aren't there anymore. So we sort of have to take over that role. It's horrific to think about, but sometimes conservationists have had to go out and actually kill thousands of deer, because otherwise they would have eaten all the food and the entire population would have collapsed. So it takes management now. We have to manage the things that the impacts we've had. We have to manage those impacts. And the way to do that is by encouraging recreational use of nature and using those funds to do the things that have to be done. So all of it, camping, canoeing, every time you pay to go into a national park, it's not expensive, but every dollar goes to preserving these areas. I'm going to move on. We're going to run out of time. I've got 2 more reasons, and then we can do the quiz. But the philosophy argument. And this, again, goes into the moral argument, but also the aesthetic argument. Philosophy and morality are often tied together because ethics is a branch of philosophy, and when we use ethics in that term, we're not talking necessarily about just moral, what's right morally, but also asking these questions: what is our role? Where do we fit? What should we be doing in the big picture, in a universal sense? And so philosophically, why are we here? Who are we? How did we get here? Why are we the way we are? If we're going to really understand a lot of these things, we've got to understand how we fit within nature, and that is going to require a lot more studying. And then finally, the legacy argument, which is, again, sort of part of the education argument and the aesthetic argument, but also the moral argument. Who wants to have